Good afternoon and good morning if you're joining us from the United States. I'm Ian Lesser from GMF here in Brussels, and thank you all very much for joining us for this discussion around Afghanistan's humanitarian future. What next? Not much, I think, needs to be too much said by me about why we're having this conversation. It's obviously a critical topic, above all critical for Afghanistan, but also critical for transatlantic partners, for the United States, for Turkey, for Europe. And we have a wonderful group together with us today to talk about the issues from all of those perspectives, including from Afghanistan. We're expecting to have Zarifa Ghaffari with us, and we're hoping that she's able to join soon, and in which case we'll bring her in. But let's go straight away into our conversation. And just to give you a little bit of a roadmap as to what we have planned, we've asked each of our speakers to share with us some thoughts around some questions that I'll pose, but to start us off just for a few minutes apiece. And then we'll go to a conversation among the speakers, and then we'll also go to all of you. And so please, when we get to the question and answers, use that Q&A function in Zoom to do that, and I'll try to get to as many as I can, being conscious of our time. So, this obviously is a crisis that Afghanistan has been mired in crisis for many decades. The humanitarian dimension of this is in no sense new, but obviously it's entered a new and critical phase with the very rapid collapse and the Taliban takeover in Afghanistan not long ago. Maybe if I could, just to start with you, Magdalena, you in your role as country director for Afghanistan for the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung, spent a lot of time on the ground based in Afghanistan, and we'd appreciate your perspectives from that experience, but also in particular what we could say about the recent UN-hosted donor conference, which raised roughly $1 billion for Afghanistan. How will this aid be used? How will it be distributed? How confident can we be that the Taliban will work with the donors on this front? What can we expect? Most grateful for your insights, Magdalena. Good to have you with us. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Ian, and thank you for the invitation. Thank you for picking up this topic. I think it's quite timely, obviously, but it also raises a lot of questions about our future with Afghanistan, which I think is something that, besides evaluating and looking at the past and also looking at past mistakes, is I think something that policymakers on both sides of the Atlantic should certainly turn to. I think for me personally, my ability or inability to be in Kabul permanently throughout the past 2 years was very much also driven by the crises that Afghanistan experienced in the past years, and that is the humanitarian crisis that is already kind of in line in the title of the event, but also the political crisis, meaning the war. And I think on the first question, the humanitarian future of Afghanistan is the present, and that is crisis that exceeds what we see right now and also goes a bit back. Behind 15 August, when the Taliban took over power in Kabul, we already had months of a looming food crisis by a severe drought that not only caused a lot of people, hundreds of thousands, to leave their homes. A lot of Afghans are basically dependent on agriculture, and climate change is, I think, something that hasn't been managed in the country well enough. But we also have seen a severe hit on Afghanistan and the humans of Afghanistan by the corona pandemic last year, and also this year, where just coinciding with the Taliban's military campaign, we had a very hard wave in Kabul, but also in other cities that basically raised the economy. And on top of this multitude of crises, we have an economic crisis that has already started in 2014, I would say, with the withdrawal of troops, of international organizations, of investments, and culminated in the past weeks when literally we couldn't pay salaries to our staff anymore because banks collapsed, and that hasn't been recovered yet. So this is basically the country that the Taliban took over. Obviously, they didn't come from the moon, so they have a huge role in running the country into the ground in the past years. But they lack, and I think that's where the international community needs to come in. They lack, just as many Afghans, the capacity to deal with these crises. Afghanistan is one of the countries that is the most dependent on international aid, both in governance, and I think that is something that we turn on, but also humanitarian. We just heard numbers from the United Nations, and you mentioned the pledge in the conference last week that pledged over $1 billion US for humanitarian aid, that by next year, mid next year, 97% of Afghans might actually be dependent on aid, as they might fall under the poverty line. The situation of women, especially of children, is extremely grave. We had progress and successes in the past decades on childbirth and the situation in the medical center, but these might all be at risk right now, and we hear dramatic stories from that. What does it mean for how we need to approach Afghanistan? I think obviously the need for the humanitarian aid is quite high. That was underlined. That is the easier part, but it's still not easy because we had a severe disruption of transportation. So even getting money and food to feed people in Afghanistan, to support people in Afghanistan, to just help out with basic needs is extremely difficult. We just in the past week had some successes, I think, with deliveries of humanitarian aid into the country, medical supplies, food, all of this. There has been border closures in the past month that I think only slowly are easing up. But all this has to be also renegotiated. Humanitarian agencies can lead the way because they have been negotiating with the Taliban in the provinces in the past years already. A lot of them have experience, but for some of them, there has to be deals renegotiated. And I think one that's the most important one is, of course, the question of the female workforce. We have seen, of course, there is no Ministry of Women now. That might not be a surprise, but the deprivation and exclusion of women, not only from education, but also from the workforce, that is a severe problem also for humanitarian aid agencies, where women are not only important in running the bureaucracies of these organizations, they're also on the ground providing military, humanitarian and medical aid. You mentioned the risk that we have. Will this be exploited and manipulated by the Taliban? I would say certainly so, as it has been the case when you looked at when ISIS was controlling territory. Humanitarian aid is not political. And there is certainly an interest by the Taliban to allow aid coming into the country, just because they also, well, at least do not want to see the people under their rule die from starvation. The compromises that they might be ready to do for humanitarian aid are low. I think it will be very critical for us to accept this in a way that we can also give commitments to the agencies who at this point can neither pay salaries for their people, but also do not know if they can extend contracts for next year, for instance, which leads to a brain drain that might hurt furthermore. I think it will get really tricky when we come to the question of development aid. Also here, Afghanistan is highly dependent on international aid. And there we are, I think, dancing right now regarding normalization. Will the Taliban be recognized as a government? I think this is something we might see more next year. This year, everybody's quite cautious, but once I think further in the discussion, we'll come to international engagements with the Taliban, where I think the question of recognition and then working constructively in building infrastructure and recovering Afghanistan torn by war, this will be certainly very critical.
Magdalena, thank you very much indeed. I mean, there are a lot of things that you've mentioned that I'm sure we will come back to, but Jacob, now maybe I could turn to you. Jacob Kurtzer is a director and senior fellow at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington. And obviously, the US is, in a sense, a stakeholder in the outcome in Afghanistan with a particular perspective. We're sitting in Washington. We'd be grateful for sort of your your take on, in this sort of new phase that we're moving into in Afghanistan, what will the United States look to do, and who will we be able to work with? Obviously, these questions of legitimizing the Taliban, the ability to work with them, challenging for everyone, maybe most challenging of all for Washington. But very grateful for your thoughts about that. Jacob, over to you. Thanks for being with us.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I think that the mood in Washington is one of, I would say, grave concern. There's a lot of anger and a lot of frustration. And I think it reflects the fact that for 20 years, people across the government and policy spectrum, you've got people at the State Department, at USAID, at the Department of Defense, and all these other agencies who have lived, worked, and tried to achieve a better outcome for Afghanistan than what we have today. So there's a lot of vested interest. And I think you saw this. The worst of what's happened over the last few months was the political nitpicking and infighting and the public, the public politicization of a humanitarian and human rights disaster. The best was that people across the policy spectrum and across agencies and across organizations and across party lines came together to try to get people out, and have still come together in working groups and conversations and in various different forums to try to find solutions for the situation as it is today. One of the challenges, I think, though, is that you still have, and it's a function of a much broader problem in the United States of hyper-politicization of every issue. You still have the attempts, the partisan attempts to politicize a humanitarian catastrophe. And that's what I think is the most urgent thing to avoid. Everyone who has come out of the woodwork in the past 6 months and said that their primary concern is the fate and the future of the Afghan civilian population should take a moment to reflect and sit back and think about what is necessary and what is the best possible outcome for the Afghan civilian population. And to me, that means trying to tone down a little bit the political rhetoric that you continue to see of people trying to make hay one way or the other out of the current situation. What does this mean in practical terms? One, Afghanistan is suffering from a series of compounding humanitarian issues that Magdalena eloquently described: COVID, drought. I would add the protection of civilians, persons impacted by the conflict, which has now been replaced by the human rights concerns, the people who are being tracked down and attacked and killed, the impacts on women and children. The compounding effect of economic isolation is going to dwarf those humanitarian challenges. If Afghanistan has no financial reserves, if people cannot feed themselves, if people are lining up for days or weeks to access money from the banks, this is an externally imposed constraint on the ability of people to sustain themselves. And that is not a humanitarian organization problem, right? That is not something that a UN agency or a non-governmental organization can resolve. Humanitarian aid is meant to be a short-term solution to an acute problem. And we're looking at a situation of total economic collapse, which is going to make the conditions today, look like a manageable problem if this continues forward. And it's a deeply troubling scenario for people to think about in the United States. You're looking at two equally bad options, right? Normally in humanitarian situations, you're looking at option A is bad and option B is worse. Option A is we find ways to release some of that funding and to provide humanitarian assistance, accepting that some of that there's going to be spillage. Some of that will go to the Taliban in some way, overtly or covertly. To me, that is the preferable option than option B, which is total economic isolation, sanctions, and other restrictive measures, which may starve the Taliban of resources, but will also starve the civilian population in a way that will be much more debilitating. The Taliban have access to other financial reserves, right? The rural Afghan farmer, the people who are living on the periphery of cities because they're displaced, have no other place to go for financial, financial stability and quality of life issues. So, to sort of wrap it up, and I'll try to conclude here. I think one, we need to think very carefully about the question of what to do with the financial reserves. And I think we need to find a way, either through the World Bank or other mechanisms, to start to release some of that money. Two, we need to find ways to alleviate the impact of the existing sanctions and absolutely must not impose further sanctions by designating the Taliban as a foreign terrorist organization. That will have a massive and debilitating impact on the ability of aid organizations to respond there. And the third is, I think a key point would be that for 20 years, the United States government has managed to muster up huge reserves of funding for military operations, for contractors, and for the associated development and bilateral assistance. And we're now in a situation where we're essentially compelled to advocate and plead for hundreds of millions of dollars for a humanitarian response. The United States government should fully fund the UN appeal and make sure that those organizations that are able to navigate that very complex operational environment have the resources to do so and are not hamstrung by a lack of resources in a context where for 20 years, we basically provided, with very little debate, substantial sums of money. We need to be able to muster up those resources going forward. So I'll stop there, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Jacob, thank you very, very much. And that actually leads us very naturally into another part of our conversation. And at this point, if I could turn Fulya to you. Fulya Memisoglu is director and is associate professor at the Department of Political Science and International Relations at Yildiz Technical University in Istanbul. And we wanted, if you could, to have you talk a little bit about the refugee side of this, the migration piece of this, both from the perspective of neighboring countries, but also as it plays into the broader questions about humanitarian assistance and policy that we've been talking about. What can we expect? And given the kind of alternatives that Jacob has laid out for us and the situation on the ground as Magdalena has described, what do you see as the likely scenarios and how might we manage them? Fulya, over to you.
Hello.
We hear you. I hear you. We seem to have lost Fulya temporarily. Anyway, hopefully. Well, let's press on, and Fulya, I'm sure will be back with us in a moment. Maybe I could just come back to the two of you to talk a little bit about, the question of the role of neighboring countries, which obviously plays directly into what Fulya was going to talk about, but also more broadly, whether we're talking about Pakistan or China or neighboring countries in Central Asia. What role do you see them playing? What can they play? What would be useful in all of this? Magdalena, maybe I could start with you.
Yeah, thank you, Ian. I mean, I think that's a really interesting question, and we have also looked into this, I think, for the last year, as everybody was looking into what would happen after the Doha agreement between the United States and the Taliban. How would the neighbors actually act? And I think what we found out, what I think is very much clear also in the behavior now, is this major interest in stability. And that is not only inside Afghanistan, but also now that we have Fulya back, also the threat of spillover, dehumanizing, of course, people seeking refuge in the neighboring countries. And not to take away what Fulya wants to say, I think it's very interesting that the Taliban have sought rapprochement with the neighboring states on addressing this issue, and now taking over already the focus on border security, and actually not having people pass that do not have the right papers. But I do not want to give away, and I think Fulya is sharing her screen with us.
I'm really
exactly
sorry.
Fulya, back to you, and Jacob. We can come back to this question, I think, after we hear from Fulya, who also has some slides to share with us, and we can move into this refugee side of the equation. Fulya, over to you. Good to have you back with us.
Yes, there seems to be a problem. This never happened to me before, but it kicked me out. Thank you very much, Ian. And taking from your point, well, obviously we need to talk about the refugee situation, but before going into that, I found this map yesterday and I think it explains most of the situation, because I think the crisis at the moment, the displacement crisis, is happening in Afghanistan, and that's where we should put the focus on. So since January, almost 500,000 people have been internally displaced. And this not only tells us about the situation in Afghanistan, but also how possible refugee movements can actually take place, because most of the time Afghans arriving in Turkey or elsewhere are actually have experienced multiple displacements, starting with internal displacement. And I guess it's also quite important to not use the refugee crisis rhetoric at the moment, because in most of the countries right now, in neighboring countries and in Turkey and in Europe, the numbers have not drastically increased, but the public perception it creates, in fact, causes social tensions among public and also quite negatively affect the lives of already existing refugees trying to set up a new life in these countries. So my point is basically Iran and Pakistan still continue to host over 90% of the refugees. Both political leaders, apparently they're sharing these in official statements that they are willing to collaborate on curbing any possible refugee influxes. And they're keen to do this through closing the borders, which are already closed, but also setting up tents and what is actually referred to as the Iranian model, and mainly accommodating refugees in the borders rather than accepting them into the country. So this is what Pakistan and Iran seem to be adopting in the near future. Tajikistan seemed to be, the country also was quite keen in hosting refugees. In a statement they have announced back in July that they would accept over 100,000 Afghans, but recently they have said, well, we're not able to do this because we don't have the infrastructure, but rather we're just going to take Afghans temporarily until they're resettled into a third country. And even though Turkey is not one of the first country of asylums, Turkey has been a significant transit hub and a destination country for Afghans for the past 2 decades. And especially since last 3 years, the numbers have drastically increased, especially irregular arrivals. And they're over, like we can say, both irregular and registered Afghans now make up almost 500,000 population in Turkey, in addition to 3.6 million Syrians currently granted temporary protection status. And Turkey, the Turkish statements were also quite clear that Turkey was not going to, does not have the capacity to accommodate any more refugees. But still, according to recent numbers, there was also not a drastic increase. But they have also sort of caught pre-COVID numbers. So around 50,000 Afghans have already entered Turkey, and it's just September. In addition to this, I guess we should also talk about secondary movements. And that's, I'm sorry. That's Europe. According to numbers from July, Afghans constituted 50% of the new applications. But here I'd like to draw attention to the recognition rates. For Syrians, for instance, recognition rates for asylum are over 90%, but for Afghans, these remain 45%. So even if Afghans manage to seek safety in Europe, it's highly likely that their application could be rejected. And also another important point, which I guess should be addressed in refugee responses, unaccompanied minors coming from Afghanistan. Half of the unaccompanied minors arriving in the EU were actually Afghans. Last year, if I still have time, I'd like to say a few words about a study we conducted last year with 3,000 Afghans in Turkey. It was on understanding their return intentions. And here, these were the major push factors they defined when leaving Afghanistan. Obviously, violence and war was the main reason, followed by economic and then personal or family reasons. And in most cases, their answers told us that these were all intertwined factors. And in most cases, even if they're deported or forcefully returned, there was a very high tendency that they could actually go back to Afghanistan. And when they have the financial means, they could come back. So even though the countries I have previously mentioned are now increasing border measures, building walls, as in the case of Turkey, it's kind of difficult to navigate these kind of refugee or migration movements, mainly because these people are seeking safety, and the destination country does not matter that much because they're actually just willing to build a new life. So that was an important finding from that study. And for the moment, these are my answers, and I'm happy to answer any upcoming questions. Thank you.
Well, thank you very, very much for this. Maybe I could come back to you, but also, others, Magdalena, Jacob, they want to weigh in on this. Obviously, it's perhaps a smaller piece of the humanitarian crisis, but as far as the sort of Western focus has been concerned, it's been one at the forefront. Those who were in some way connected with the West, connected with forces in the country, connected with humanitarian operations in the country, connected with the media, or simply living a kind of middle-class, educated, professional lifestyle, people who simply will want to get out. Clearly, large numbers of these people have not been able to get out yet. Will they be able to get out? Is there a likelihood that land borders will start to open up in a way that would facilitate that? And what can we do to facilitate it? Should we facilitate it? Fulya, maybe I'll start with you and then we'll go around.
A very important point, Ian, I missed in my presentation is the fact that migrant smuggling networks play a huge role in this whole migration journey. So even if, for instance, when the land borders were closed with Pakistan, they started, the migrant smuggling network started using Pakistan, and then people were arriving in Iran and then coming to Turkey. This was not a previously used route before. So in my opinion, as long as there are financial means to support themselves to embark on these journeys, and obviously this will depend on how the political situation turns out in Afghanistan. But we should remember that there's this sector involving in migration journeys, and it's kind of inevitable. And obviously there are people who are in need of international protection, and their rights need to be reserved.
Jacob, let me come back to you on this question, or anything else you'd like to reflect on based on what you just heard.
Yeah, I would say the first thing is I would neither encourage it nor discourage it. We have to remember that there are conventions and international agreements. Migration is a right. And if people fear that they're at credible risk of persecution by virtue of their ethnicity or the work that they've done or their gender, as might be the case in Afghanistan, then I think doing whatever we can to enable them to find safe refuge is our responsibility. The challenge is that we can look at Afghanistan in a vacuum, or you can look at Fulya's map and realize that the context in which we're engaged in from a perspective of Washington is one that is already extremely complicated from a quote geopolitical perspective. You've got some prior to the events of this past few months, you already were seeing Afghans being pushed back into Afghanistan from Iran because of the deteriorating economic conditions there, the rise of COVID in that country, and the impact of US sanctions on Iran. And so Afghans were being pushed back in from Iran, already pushed back in from Pakistan. And so the expectation that now they're going to reopen their borders, thinking about the diplomatic challenge that exists for the current administration, which also wants to negotiate, wants to revisit the JCPOA, has its own, a whole host of issues, to put it mildly, with the government of China. I mean, the context in which this is all happening is quite challenging. So, you know, I think the important thing is to try to make available the option for those who seek to pursue it. And then again, it would come back to me, to these questions about sanctions and economic opportunity. I think I have read reports of people leaving because they have no economic future, and as much as they're leaving because they're at a credible fear of persecution. And so taking measures now to allow people to make that choice, right? To think that they either have a future or they don't. I don't want to encourage it, because I do think that there is real concern about, you know, the loss of expertise and technical and you know, intellectual capacity that has been developed over the past 20 years. I think we've already seen that with the numbers of people who have departed already. But I do think, you know, we need to start with, what is the law? What are the rights and conventions for people to migrate or to seek refuge? To make that option available through you know, credible and meaningful diplomacy with neighboring countries and with countries of third countries, and take the steps to enable people to try to rebuild their lives in Afghanistan, so that they don't feel compelled to leave for either or any of these reasons.
Thanks. Magdalena, share some thoughts with us. And I'm particularly interested in your take on the question of what would the Taliban's view be about these various you know, approaches to refugees, borders, allowing people to leave the country, but also this problem that Jacob just raised with us of kind of the, you know, the deprofessionalization of the country, the brain drain and all the rest of it. I mean, is that, will they favor that because out of ideological purity? Or is this something that they'll seek to oppose for other reasons? What do you think?
Thank you, Ian. And also, it's a great point that have been raised so far. And I maybe start with the second one. Because I was trying in my initial remarks to hint at it. I think the biggest employer, obviously, in Afghanistan had been probably the US government or the international community, especially for women. Who are single breadwinners and are now, if they're still in the country, out of a job and have little chance to be employed by the government. And the government was the second biggest employer, and that also has been reduced. We hear that many people haven't received salaries for several months. So not only when the Taliban took over, they haven't been really paid before. So we have a huge workforce without any alternative income that are skilled labor. That want to seek to get out of this, the situation. And I think it's quite split, the reality in this, like, let's call it post-evacuation Afghanistan. There are a lot of people who are still very afraid. We still get a lot of notes from people who are afraid. There are other people who report from house searches. Right now, we haven't seen like massacres of like translators or these kind of groups, but there's certainly more repression. And there's also, while a positive signaling happens, for instance, to Western journalists, there is repression towards Afghan media workers and Afghan human rights activists. So people still have an interest in leaving the country, being it for pure security reasons, being it just for ideological reasons that do not favor to live in a country where their daughters would be deprived of the right to education, or being it for economic reasons, which, as Fulya also said, is one of the reasons why we didn't talk about migration from Afghanistan only since a month. My concern is a bit right now, and that there is kind of a two-class system Afghanistan, and I will try to phrase that carefully, just from the realities that we've seen so far. There is no interest in the neighboring states, and I would add Turkey, and I would add India, and probably the European Union, in a Taliban policy of open borders. There is pressure on opening borders for the transfer of goods into the country, humanitarian, but not the flow of people. So there is no one, apart from maybe us having like a humanitarian appeal, to actually pressuring the Taliban government to do that. Quite the opposite. Before Kabul fell, the prices, black market for Turkey visa was roughly 5,000, which was dollars, which was still cheaper than paying a smuggler. But there are even reports that there is more pressure on smuggling networks, so that the Taliban are also quite aware of this activity and also cracking down on this. So the rapprochement that the Taliban seem to have struck with the neighboring countries is that they're basically now the border police, which leads us, of course, in quite a limbo if we still want to get people out and want to, as Jacob also said, still enable this avenue. The major transit states for evacuations right now, and that's not a secret, of course, Qatar, Pakistan, Central Asia, Fulya as mentioned, have little appetite to actually keep these people. Qatar has been like the major hub for the US evacuations, but Afghans haven't stayed there. It's the same with Pakistan. It's basically impossible to get a visa as a normal Afghan for Pakistan if you don't have a stamp in your passport, literally, from a foreign country that would commit to resettlement. And I think that is something, Fulya also hinted to it, which will be a quite interesting discussion, especially with the European Union about resettlement. I think the neighboring states do expect resettlement, and not only from the people that come now, but Iran and Pakistan already host like a lot of Afghan refugees and do have, being it's a reality or perception, the idea that the boat is full, so to say, that this is a burden on their economy that they're not willing to endure anymore. But resettlement is also quite a difficult issue for the European Union, at least, because that is something that you would actively have to encourage. And we do remember that the most shameful moment of EU Afghanistan policy was the decision to still stick to deportations literally until Kabul fell. So I think this will be for the EU foreign policy quite tricky to find a rapprochement with the neighboring countries who expect support in this area, who will not be satisfied just with money, but also finding a rapprochement within the European Union on having settlement as part of the policy towards Afghanistan.
Magdalena, thank you very much. And I want to remind all of you who've joined us online that you're more than free to put questions in the Q&A function, and we'll try to get to those. I'll start on those in a moment. But maybe if I could just turn to you all with another question. I mean, clearly there's so many dimensions to the humanitarian strategy and assistance that we can envision over the next years. Who should lead it? Who will take the lead in this? Are we simply going to be looking at ad hoc arrangements, even at some scale, or is it for the UN? Is it a coalition of countries, maybe even the neighbors? People talk even about China. This is hardly an American interest, but still people are debating this. What is your take on that? Who has the lead in what is likely to be a, at best a multi-year and maybe much longer process of kind of reconstruction, stabilization, humanitarian assistance? Fulya, maybe I can start with you, and Jacob, Magdalena, please weigh in.
If I understand your question correctly, you're asking for a country to be.
Well, who in the international, who's going to take on the leadership of sort of a strategy and securing resources, and or will it simply be done on a kind of ad hoc basis? Is it a UN mission? Who will do it?
If you were having this presentation perhaps 2 months ago, this discussion, I would have probably flagged out Turkey, but that turned out not very positive on Turkey's side, since Taliban made it very clear that they do not want any foreign troops being present in the country. But when it comes to other financial issues such as development aid, as Magdalena mentioned, and infrastructural assistance, I guess Turkey has the potential to play an important role in that respect, but we will see what would happen. And obviously would, I would also flag out China, but I'm not an expert, so I would just leave it to that. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much. Jacob, how do you see that?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, because I think there's the technical side of it, which is a humanitarian universe sectoral question, and then there's the broader side of it, which is how does the humanitarian fit into the political and economic question. So on the technical side, I think a lot of people are falling back on the idea of a large UN-led response. And the benefits of this is that, and I will keep harping on this issue about sanctions, is that because the UN is an international organization with certain immunities, donors like the United States and some of the European, the key contributors can feel a certain level of greater comfort running operations through UN agencies with whom they have longstanding relationships for those operations to be managed more effectively. And you're right, this is a multi-year process that we're looking at, and the UN has, with all, with the strikes and gutters of UN operations, there have had success in running large-scale operations in some similar contexts. The problem is that running a large humanitarian operation through the UN has what I would describe as, it's not a negative impact, but it doesn't get the most positive impact you can have, which is for 20 years, the international community has been developing, supporting financially, providing technical support to the first responders in Afghan communities, villages, rural areas, and cities. There are a multitude of Afghan-led NGOs and civil society organizations that are best placed to meet the needs of their communities and their co-nationals. And a large UN-led operation, in many ways, ends up bypassing these organizations and has a second-order effect of, kind of pushing them out of the way. And this is where I come back to this question of the sanctions. Those organizations are unable to navigate sanctions by the UN and by the United States and by other European organizations. And this is why I think this question is so critical, because if those sanctions are mitigated in various different ways, either through the provision of general licenses or through getting rid of the designations entirely in the short term, the UN and donors can work much more closer with those local organizations and achieve a two-part impact. One, better response, right? Because those organizations are closer to the communities. And two, they're empowering local organizations by funding them, giving people jobs, and and sort of getting out of the way. And so on the technical side, I really do think this has to be a UN-led operation, but I think one that really looks to find ways to pick up the pieces that have been dropped over the past 6 to 9 months of rebuilding the relationship and putting those local organizations first. I also think kind of on the first question of situating it within the larger picture, this is an area where the United States can fund, but should look to maybe European partners, but I would also look at the Nordic states, Norway, Switzerland. Some of these countries have a long history of taking the lead where their reputation and capacity is not marred by their participation in the conflict. So I don't know who, I couldn't say specifically in this case, look to country X, but I do think we should be a little bit more thoughtful about, are there entities, organizations, or states that are able to play kind of this neutral intermediary role in negotiating between the UN and international donor-funded humanitarian response and the Taliban authorities?
Thanks, Jacob. Magdalena, how do you see that? And it's just another question that occurs to me, if you want to have a crack at it. To what extent might an ongoing counterterrorism, sort of strategy in Afghanistan, because you could well imagine a kind of over the horizon, more limited, but over the horizon counterterrorism activity that could go on for many years. I mean, is it possible to, on the one hand, work with the Taliban on humanitarian reconstruction in the country, and on the other hand, have this over the horizon counterterrorism operation ongoing? Well, in a sense, that's a microcosm of what we had for the last 20 years, I guess you could say, but still the conditions now are very, very different, and the Taliban is in charge.
On the last point, I sincerely hope that this is over. I think we've just seen, like last week with the attack, the drone strike that killed the civilians, that the lack of intelligence that we have on the ground, and these measures are like the worst part of the 20-year history that we had. The best outcome of this, I think, counterterrorism cooperation with the Taliban entity would be that they point at people they don't like and say they are ISIS. So I think we would basically fall into the same trap if we follow the idea of kinetic counterterrorism support. They will get enough support, I think, in that regard from the Chinese and probably the Russians. There's a lot of, that's a second focus on the Taliban's conversation with the neighboring states, but it will certainly not help us reach the goals that we actually have if we want to talk about something positive for Afghanistan's future. So I honestly hope that with this horrible strike, any fantasies about continuing over the horizon counterterrorism operations in Afghanistan have passed. I absolutely second what Jacob has said, and just want to underline the problem with the sanctions. I mean, that is also something, even for our organizations, every international organization that is now in Afghanistan, although like tax revenues weren't super high, has to pay taxes. We had in our community a lot of conversations about humanitarian organizations operating in Taliban areas. And I said it in the beginning, the Taliban have been a governance reality for many Afghans for the past years. And they approached organizations and say, you are now with us, you have to pay taxes, which they will certainly do for international organizations that are now in Kabul. But under the current legal status, we would not be allowed to pay taxes to a Taliban government as it's not recognized and under sanctions. But that, as I said, that limits our ability to be active and operating. That is the same for Afghan NGOs. That means you cannot pay your staff. And worst case, you could even endanger your staff and your operations, because I cannot imagine a guard saying, no, thank you, Mr. Taliban minister, we're not, we don't give you any money, you're terrorists. So I think this is something where we have to be pragmatic and have to be aware of the limitations that are actually on the ground, that are imposed by sanctions. And of course, it's a bit hypocritical to have like an internationally recognized agreement with an organization that especially commits the US to push for like sanction release. And then just because the outcome of the negotiations didn't go our way, it's difficult to now then come with petty sanctions. But I'm aware, obviously, and if we had Zarifa with us, she would probably also point to the question that we shouldn't legalize or legitimize the Taliban so easy, because we're still in a context where political power in Afghanistan comes from the outside. So the Taliban are aware that it is the checkbook from the foreigners that will also help them consolidate their power, just as it did for the former government. So I think we are in a dilemma. It's obviously not an easy situation, but I think the question of sanction relief to even be able to continue to start thinking about this. And I also think that the United Nations, which were struggling in the past decades to get the coordinating role that they should have, there was NATO coordinating, EU coordinating, member states doing what they want, and the UN, which everybody ascribes to having this role, was kind of sidelined. So I think for the operations on the ground, especially right now, the UN still gets meeting with Taliban leadership. They're still able to, without being punished, to meet other like groups in the Afghan civil society. I think what is important, though, for the transition, when we come to the question that at some point, because also Afghanistan's development is dependent on foreign aid and jobs have to be created, and that cannot be happened through humanitarian aid, then of course the member states have to come back in. I think it should not be a UN project and everybody else moves on and just donates. And I think we can look at some of the gray zones that we have right now, for instance, on Turkey and the question of the airport, because I think here we have there's a fine line between a humanitarian airport and a commercial airport that would allow for development and actually international cooperation that could serve at least as a balloon, if I can say so, to see how we can normalize relations with the Taliban, how far are they gonna go? And I think some of the member states can be a bit more pragmatic than others. But this could certainly help. My biggest question, because Jacob mentioned the Nordic state, is of course, do we see any role for the international community in the actual reconciliation and peace process, if I may say, so that it's still needed? The Taliban gave themselves and gave everybody amnesty, but didn't, of course, apologize to anyone for their crimes or for what they did against the civilians, and that could, of course, lead to a new war or a new conflict that is right now unaddressed.
Thanks, Magdalena. We have quite a number of questions that have come in from our virtual audience, and so I'm going to try to get to some of those now. One of them actually follows very naturally from what you were just talking about, Magdalena, on this question of resources, but also the legitimacy of the government. And it comes from my colleague in Ankara, Özgür Ünlü-Zarçıklı, who's asking about untapped resources that Afghanistan may have. Now, there's debate out there about how significant those are and how easy they would be to exploit, but we could talk about that. But the question really is, would Western companies working in Afghanistan for the extraction of these resources amount to aiding the Taliban's human rights, aiding and abetting the Taliban's human rights violation, or does it provide the Taliban with an additional motivation to moderate its policies? How do you see that? There have been a lot of pieces written about the potential, mainly from a geopolitical, geoeconomic point of view, but it seems to me, as Özgür's question states, it goes to the humanitarian dimension as well. Whoever would like to pick up on that. Magdalena, go ahead, please, and then others.
Well, I haven't read Özgür's question yet, but I think on the resources, I think it is quite known that both Afghanistan has a lot of resources, like copper, for instance, and a lot of rare earth, and it also has this really interesting geostrategic location, which could be interesting for the transport of energy from Central to South Asia. I think one part in this discussion is some of the problems that we're now having with the Taliban. We had that with the previous government too. There were a lot of people who benefited from half shady deals. There was a lot of discomfort and unfavorable conditions for foreign investments, which was the reason why a lot of companies didn't invest in, and there was endemic instability. One thing that I actually just learned, and I always read these op-eds that said Afghanistan has so many untapped resources, that a lot of these mines are already exploited, but they're exploited illegally by mafia and criminal organization. And that's also a reality that we sometimes overlook. And this is something that for the Taliban could be quite difficult because now they're in a different role. If they would act in the interest of the state that they're now ruling, they of course have to nationalize that and make sure that they first get the control over it. But that also means potential conflict with neighboring states where you have these smuggling networks, timber getting smuggled over the Pakistani border. I think that's going to be a huge security problem for the Taliban that they would have to address. I think the general, and this is of course when we look beyond Kabul, in a bizarre way, these are probably the most peaceful days that a lot of Afghans have experienced because you don't have the fighting anymore. In the past years, Afghanistan always had about 10,000 civilian casualties, dead or injured, from the war, and now in most of these areas you don't have these kind of battles and fightings anymore, and there are no airstrikes anymore. But I think the Taliban right now have to start policing also the economy. They are, for the past years, they had to take care only funding their own fighters because they graciously just use the government services in the areas that they're under their control, and they make money with smuggling and border traffic right now. They don't have an economy that they're running. I think they would have an interest in giving licenses away, but they will have the same problem that the previous government has, and that is weak governance, weak state structures, and very powerful criminal network that could undermine that potential.
Magdalena, thanks very much. Jacob, Fulya, please come in on this, but also to link it to actually a few questions that have come in around the question of criminality in the economy, the drug trade, its role perhaps even in influencing refugee and migration policy elsewhere, the perceptions about this. How is this likely to work? Also this question about resources and mining, if you want to come in on that as well. Jacob, go ahead.
Yeah, on the question of resources, it is far beyond the scope of my expertise to know about what's there and so on and so forth. But I do think that you can look at this question in the same framing as you have two bad options. We could all agree and start with the premise that the Taliban is a very bad actor and that their behaviors are bad and should not be rewarded. The question becomes one of, are we going to achieve a better outcome for the Afghan civilian population and the world through total isolation or through allowing some sort of economic activity to re-engage? Now, am I saying American companies should be the first ones in? No, absolutely not. But I look around the world and I see the countries that have been in total isolation, and I look at the countries that have been in not total isolation, which have equivalently malign actors in their leadership. And the ones that are in total isolation are so far in such worse, extremely bad human conditions that it boggles my mind that people are still trying to pursue this course of action. We just have to accept, in my view, that there are things that we can't control and that there is going to be second order effects that we don't like. But I do think that for the sake of the Afghan civilian population, some level of economic normalization, economic activity is far superior than billions of dollars of humanitarian aid. That's on that resources question. On the question of criminality, again, I think the more normalized the environment can be, the less opportunity there is for criminal networks to exploit vulnerable people. So if the situation, if the tone and tenor, the rhetoric between international, between states and the Taliban can be brought down a few notches, and we can get to some sort of normal border crossing, some sort of flight path, some sort of, the return to some regularity in how people move, it undermines the opportunity for those criminal networks to exploit those people who choose to leave. We've seen it over and over again when, that these persons who are extremely vulnerable, the harder it is to move places, the more they're susceptible to this kind of exploitation. And so, to me, there's a real opportunity to, I think we need to also remember that this is the exact outcome that was negotiated last year at Doha, right? Like, this is not a surprise. We've had a year and change to think about what it means for the agreement that the previous administration of the United States negotiated. To me, this was the outcome that everyone expected. And so for people to be acting now like this is a surprise strikes me as odd. And what we should be thinking about is the ways in which we can, on the edges and on the margins, reduce the harms to the greatest extent possible, while accepting that there's going to be second order effects that we don't like.
Thanks. And I want to come back to that question of why, of surprise and explaining the surprise, because there are a number of questions that came in that sort of are around that in a way. But Fulya, maybe I could come to you also to pick up on the criminality issue, both in the context of smuggling, but also human trafficking, and how it might play into what we could expect on the refugee front.
Thank you. I was actually thinking, I wanted to refer to this because the recent coverage in Turkey, in Europe as well, in public discourse and media discourse, there's gender blindness for sure. It's Afghan refugees, although yes, majority are male, there's still females who also leave the country, sometimes on their own. Recent arrivals in Greece had over 40% of female household leaders as women. So it's also quite difficult to stereotype the refugees as if they would all be engaged in criminal activities. But obviously there's a drug trafficking dimension, as you mentioned, there's a human trafficking dimension, and obviously this creates a very negative public perception in possible host countries. And how to fight this? I guess one answer would be empowering women, and in terms of helping them to become active members of their own society, because they're the ones also raising the Afghan children. And I guess in the next years to come, this would even become much more important in understanding the cultural, societal dynamics in Afghanistan. That would be one answer, but also it's a question that I'm very puzzled with as well, because this is exactly how the public reaction in Turkey against a possible Afghan inflow was sort of described. So it will be a challenge, but I guess effective integration policies for those who arrive already, who are already in host countries, would be one way. Yeah, these are my points.
Thanks very much. I want to throw in a question of my own, if I could, at this point, and that is, and I'll come back to some of the others we've received, but is there a risk that we will simply face a kind of Afghanistan fatigue? I mean, it's quite extraordinary how it's already essentially gone not only off the front pages of major newspapers, but even, you know, out of the newspaper entirely. The humanitarian crisis will go on, as you've described, all of you. Is there a risk that simply of a lack of political attention to this? And who knows what other crises we'll be facing internationally that will prove additional distractions. But I mean, how do you rate that? Would ever like to come in on it? I mean, Jacob, maybe over to you, because, you know, obviously there's something of a political calculus here in the United States as well about ending the military engagement in Afghanistan, but that question about fatigue could equally apply in a different way to the humanitarian commitment.
Yeah, thanks. Indeed, I think that's a priority concern. You know, I refer back to the original answer to the first question about these groups of people that have come together, you know, working groups, networks, especially on the evacuations, have continued to meet on these second questions: humanitarian assistance, the rights of women and vulnerable populations. I think this is top of mind, which is why I think there's an impetus now to get those commitments for funding, get some of those bureaucratic and regulatory obstacles out of the way, while there is still the attention, the energy, and the enthusiasm. And in some ways, we're playing offense and defense. We're trying to encourage increased funding. We're trying to encourage creative thinking around some of these restrictive measures, the sanctions and otherwise, but also playing defense against you know, those who would seek to impose further restrictions and further sanctions. The one thing that you mentioned this question earlier, and I want to bring it back in the context of fatigue, is this idea of a remaining counterterrorism interest. And Magdalena correctly pointed out that the, you know, culminating strike was shown to be a truly human disaster in so many ways, and it has exposed that for 20 years, without the attention of the international community on one city and one issue within a city, these kinds of strikes have had a devastating humanitarian impact, right? Loss of life, loss of you know, injury, loss of life, you know, is a humanitarian crisis and has been happening for 20 years. And so, you know, what will be extremely disconcerting is if there is a fatigue on responding to the humanitarian issues, while there remains an interest in carrying out these kinds of kinetic counterterrorism strikes, where we will be continuing to generate, to some degree or another, humanitarian consequences, while not paying close enough attention to the overall totality of the humanitarian picture. And, you know, it would sort of give lie to the idea of this is the end of the forever wars if we, you know, by we, I mean the United States government, continues to engage in these kinds of strikes, knowing full well that the likelihood of civilian harm is far greater than even was last week or two when we had military presence on the ground. You know, drones are not precise tools, and we've known that. We've known it for years, and we shouldn't be relying on those kinds of techniques to maintain an interest, especially as, you're right, the attention will wane because of Ethiopia and Haiti and Yemen and Syria and elsewhere.
Magdalena, how do you see that? Are you worried about the fatigue question?
I mean, Yemen was just mentioned, and I mean, FAS, like our foundation, has like more than 100 offices, and we work in Yemen, Syria, like we work on Ethiopia. Like we are used to to working on forgotten conflicts in a way. And I think, I mean, if we see the other side of the coin, there was a lot of interest and extreme amount of funds flowing into Afghanistan. So, but at the same time, during our engagement, inequality in Afghanistan grew. And the scenario that I just described in the beginning from the UN about basically 100% of Afghans being poor happened under our watch. So the question is the attention that is politically driven and not needs-based and not actually implemented with good policies, was that helpful for Afghans? I would have like a question mark maybe on that. One of our colleagues, when we talked about the implication of the withdrawal, said, well, maybe there might be a scenario where Afghanistan is just a poor country at war, and doesn't get the military presence in NATO and longest war. And because I think, especially as a German, it was quite hard for me to explain to Afghan counterparts how random our engagement at some point was. If 9/11 would have been conducted by a group with a base in Uganda, like probably we would follow the NATO mission there. So I think the fatigue question is something that too much intention for the wrong reasons, especially for the counterterrorism reasons, I think that leads us into the next trap. What we do need is the needs assessment, and then aim and instrumentalize or design policies that address this humanitarian situation that we face in Afghanistan. But as Fulya also said, the Afghan humanitarian crisis goes beyond the borders. So we have to find a way to also address it in Iran. In Turkey, I mean, Fulya described it quite well, but it's very interesting that you have a split policy. The men are at risk of getting deported, but nobody wants to deport women and children, so they end up in the streets of Istanbul as beggars. So there is like this idea that we do treat women differently, but they certainly not help. One thing that could be an answer to what Fulya said is, last week I visited our staff here in a shelter, and they came with their families. And I think that is something where I even thought, the people in this random village where our Afghan staff and their families are now for the first week, they probably have the same prejudices that Fulya also described. Single Afghan men, like what will they do? But now they see women and they see children and they see like families. And I think that is why resettlement and like an active, deliberate act of resettlement is so important, to also generate empathy and experience of likeness between host communities and those seeking refuge. So I think that is certainly something that in Europe we can switch the idea that we got in 2015 that it's only single young Afghan men who want to steal our money or something. I think that is really something that just a quick, like a slight change in how we bring people into safe areas could also change, I think, the perception of these.
Magdalena, if I could just follow up, can you imagine a situation in which Western, international, I should say, aid workers will be able to operate inside the country again and would be willing to go? How essential is that?
I mean, for us, it's different because we're development aid, and that's right now frozen. Humanitarian workers, whoever I talk to, say, I'm waiting for the next flight. But I think that's also because we have seen that, especially the journalists, they're like treated nicely. There haven't been the number, actually, they say the crime in Kabul has gone down. So, but I think even of kidnappings, which was quite high for Western, for like aid workers, might be lower. They say there are no thieves because there's nothing to steal. But no, I think for Westerners, it could be easier. I think the problem is right now more that for the local staff, they're well aware that they're more vulnerable. And that's why I think a lot of them are still like cautious about staying or returning. And we didn't even talk about the remittances, how you can support your family that's still there. I think for Westerners, I would, especially the ones who have worked in the country before and have like accommodated, I think it would be possible. The question is just what would they do? What is our political aim? And what are the limitations? I think a lot of them are very protective of their staff, rightly so, and say, if I come back, I don't want to be a fig leaf, because all the Afghan female workers have been fired, and I'm there and Taliban invite me for tea every 5 minutes because I bring the money. I think that is something where people should be hesitant. But I do think in the community itself, and that is also one of the reasons why the evacuation was so chaotic, because there was, I think, in the development and humanitarian community, the perception was the troops go and it will not pull away the rug under our feet, and we can stay and continue to operate. But that was obviously then not the case. But I think it didn't stop because people didn't want to work and help Afghans.
Magdalena, thanks very much. And Fulya, I did want to come back to you on this sort of broader question of fatigue as seen from outside the country. And you know, some aspects of it that relate to what you've been talking about. But please, I wanted to give you an opportunity to come in on that.
I guess the fatigue is most felt in the refugee case, because obviously since 2015, especially with the Syria displacement, many countries, even though they're not immediate neighbors of Afghanistan, Europe, Turkey have been feeling the pressure, both at the discursive level, but also on the political level. So in response to that, even if Afghans, obviously they are in a very dire humanitarian situation, it would be highly difficult for governments to convince their public that they have to increase their resettlement numbers. Then what I mean is that even if there's willingness at the policy level, I wonder how this can turn into a public opinion or an electoral a vote response. So there's a gap there, and I guess it needs to be addressed, but I don't know how. We would need to analyze this more in depth.
Okay, several questions have come in related to China. I know we mentioned China briefly earlier, but maybe from the three of you, if you have thoughts about the role that China could possibly play on any of these fronts if it wished to commit substantial resources, either on its own or as part of an international effort, or are they simply going to want to hold all of this at arm's length? Jacob, what do you think?
So I'm gonna loop in the previous question you asked to Magdalena and my answer. International organizations are still present in Kabul and elsewhere in Afghanistan. The Taliban's given written assurances to UNHCR. And I think it's worthwhile to remember that many of these organizations, the UN agencies, WFP, UNICEF, UNHCR, the International Committee of the Red Cross, and even the non-governmental organizations associated with the United States or European countries, were working in Taliban-held areas for much of the past 20 years, and some of them going back to the previous era of Taliban control. You know, Western staff, you know, most of these staff, even the internationals, are not Europeans, right? They could be from all over the world. And so there's always questions about passports and stuff, like who can work where, but they're prepared to work. I mean, they're there, some of them are already present. They might be sitting tight for security, but they're prepared to work if they have the resources and the confidence, both from the Taliban and from their donors, that they can do so free of safety and legal risk. On the question of China, we did a small project last year on China's humanitarian endeavors, right? Chinese do humanitarian assistance much closer to what we would call disaster response. They're very good at responding to natural disasters and tend to shy away from these complex emergencies where conflict overlaps. There's plenty of natural disaster to respond to in Afghanistan. There's drought, there's COVID, and so I do think you will see the Chinese playing a slightly more assertive role in responding to the humanitarian issues to achieve whatever their strategic aims might be. They've already announced a $30 million contribution, the details of which I'm not exactly familiar. But I do think there actually is an opportunity here to encourage them to pay more. The Chinese tend to not support the international organizations that we're most comfortable with, the UN agencies and the NGOs, they tend to do their humanitarian assistance bilaterally. But this is an opportunity, I think, to bring them into the fold, to say, do your bilateral assistance if you're so inclined, but also, there's certain things that literally only the World Food Program can do in terms of logistics and moving large amounts of commodities from point A to point B, and buy them into the necessity for those humanitarian operations to continue. And I think, again, to the point of economic opportunity is a greater good for the humanitarian outcome than the delivery of humanitarian assistance, to the extent that they play a meaningful or constructive role in some sense in helping people at various different levels sustain themselves. And I think that can be seen, if we can block it out of great power competition dynamics, to the extent that their economic activity can help people in Afghanistan sustain themselves through work, then that would be an independent good. But it is complicated, and their calculus there, I think, is very different from ours because of the proximity, and because of the potential for spillover, and because of some of their own domestic considerations. But I think it is worth watching very closely.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. Fulya, Magdalena, if you just want to come in briefly on China, if you want. I also have a last question which pulls together a couple of other thoughts from our audience, which I'm going to ask all of you. But before we get to that, so I'm conscious of our time. Anything on China to add? Magdalena,
yeah, I want to come into that just quickly, but Jacob talked about the humanitarian. I think what we can see is that China is now ready or willing to fill the gap. I think this was like a big discussion last year, but Chinese officials didn't show any interest like filling the US void or getting even to engage. They didn't present themselves as mediators as others did. They pointed to the UN. So it's hands off with, I would say, a finger in the water. As Jacob also described, what might be really interesting to watch too is the cooperation between the Taliban and the Chinese government on, say, border security. I think they will continue what they did with the previous government, like investments in border security, maybe training, even some special forces, which they did in the past. There are reports that Chinese officials were also guests in the Ministry of Telecommunication, which of course reminds us that Afghanistan borders Xinjiang, and of course there is a high interest in from the Chinese side on what is happening on Afghanistan's eastern border. So I think these would be things to watch in addition. I don't see like a military presence or a huge footprint by Chinese companies. I think also maybe a last point, the inclusion in the Belt and Road Initiative. Afghanistan regularly performs the weakest on all infrastructure indices. I don't think that China has a big appetite to waste funds in that. But I think what's interesting is a lot of Afghans saw like China's Afghanistan policy mostly through Pakistan, because the Chinese-Pakistan relationship has been much closer in the past years. And of course, stability in Afghanistan could improve Pakistan and Chinese economic cooperation. So I think if we see more, this would be in the interest, but it's all under the impression that China prefers regime stability independent of whom, if I to say so. They have, of course, there were concerns that a Taliban win could encourage, I don't know, radical forces inside China, but that was not the kind of win. And it's not the kind of rhetoric from the Taliban, who also are very careful how they address the situation of Muslims in China. So I think what we will see is probably a regime cooperation like China does it with other, well, neighboring states, especially in the fields of technology, cyber, and security.
Thanks. Fulya, China?
I might pass, but
okay.
just one thing that I was thinking in relation to China when we talked about this earlier. I guess being one of the prominent global humanitarian actors in a country like Afghanistan would also require some internal dynamics to be in place, right? In relation to human rights, the refugee policy, etc. So in those cases, China seems to be quite distant, and I wonder how it would play out if they become quite active, they take a prominent role in Afghanistan. Would they take in Afghan refugees, for instance? Highly unlikely.
Yeah. I'm conscious of our time, but I didn't want to end before asking a question that came up in a number of, well, the questions we got in the Q&A. And it's in some ways an obvious one, but also maybe not such an easy one. What happened? In other words, not an assessment of 20 years of what went wrong, but why did the Afghan government collapse so quickly? Magdalena, I guess you were still on the ground when that happened. So, maybe I'll start with you.
So luckily, I was not on the ground when that happened.
I'm glad to hear that.
I was the last time in Kabul in the end of June, which I think was basically between Joe Biden announced the unconditional withdrawal, which I think was morally, and I mean, nobody knows why exactly it happened, but maybe I can name a few points that I would try to mention. First is the moral, departure, let's say it like this, of the US. And I think it was even worse than the Soviet withdrawal, which was always seen as like a parallel one, because I think the interdependency between the Afghan government and the Afghan social class that was holding the republic was much stronger. I think for a lot of Afghans elites, their president was not Ashraf Ghani, but Joe Biden. And there have been so much hope with this president. And then he basically said everything we said before doesn't matter to us anymore. And that accelerated, not started, the departure of elites. I mean, when I left Kabul, like planes were full, everybody who had the option of leaving started to. And I think that created like a moral crisis that was difficult to contain by a government that didn't really have any tools at hand and was already marked, to say, like the loser of the game, because it also became clear that for the US government, handing over the country to the Taliban was not a red line. It was something we hoped to avoid, but I think certainly for Joe Biden at that point, it was like something they priced in. And then, of course, it was not only the morale, it was also the de facto capacities that were missing, that were withdrawing, that people kind of hoped would stay. There was a lot of questions whether the military contractors would stay, whether it would be so obvious that the Air Force would not be able to function anymore if like US capacities were out, that someone would come up with a magical trick. I think that was why I felt there wasn't so much pushback or even statements from the Afghan government, because people still hoped that especially the US wouldn't allow a scenario like this. Someone would pick up a magical trick and it would stop. And I think the last point from our side was the evacuation. There was the miscalculation, of course, that the government, that was what was talked about in June, the government would hold until January and then you would muddle through. But I think the collapse or the handover, more or less, of the bigger cities, which is in itself, of course, good and bad, because it's very bad for the government, good for people who didn't die in like Raqqa or Mosul scenarios that we also had in mind for, especially for Kabul, but also for Mazar Sharif and Herat. I think that created like a domino effect that then led to the decision to evacuate the US embassy, which I think was the moment when it was clear that Kabul would fall. And I mean, we're happy that it didn't turn out into a Sarajevo scenario, but I think a lot of people were still shocked and caught by surprise.
Hey, Fulya, what would be your take on why the government collapsed so rapidly?
I've been doing field work with Afghan refugees for the past 3-4 years, since 2017. And to me, it didn't come as such a big surprise, to be honest, from all the stories and narratives I've heard from them, the way they left the country, the way that the political situation was unstable, but also the institutions themselves. in terms of accessing education, healthcare, but also like even the bank system. It was difficult to comprehend. So all the instabilities added together, obviously this doesn't explain the quickness of how the events have escalated. But at the same time, it seems as a story that have been following for the past 3-4 years. In terms of how a country perhaps became a failed state, understanding from the way people started fleeing in larger numbers.
Yeah, thanks very much. Jacob, let's end with you. And maybe I'll just mention an interview, it was a very brief one that I believe it was in the Financial Times with Zalmay Khalilzad a few days ago. It's the only interview I think he's given so far, in which he cited the flight of Ashraf Ghani as the sort of proximate cause of the collapse. He doesn't argue that it was more than that, but how do you see it? Were you surprised at why did the government collapse so rapidly?
I mean, I think you need to start in like January of 2002, right? There's the glib line of 20-year war fought 1 year at a time, and I think you have a 20-year governance project fought 1 year at a time. The evaluations of why the military collapsed, why the Afghan National Forces collapsed, are pretty clear. The United States tried to create a military in its own image that relied on infrastructure, techniques, methodologies that were not sustainable in the absence of US support. And I think you could apply the same exact post-mortem to the government, right? You created a technocratic system of government that heavily relied on international expertise, international support, and international funding. And so the only area where I would sort of lightly quibble with my co-panelists is Joe Biden has been advocating for this since 2012. So the idea that this would have come as a surprise, I think people projected onto Joe Biden what they wanted for Afghanistan, and partly because there was, I think, a sense of there will be a more thoughtful process. So I think there's clearly failures on the few months that happened here. I don't, and I think those should be evaluated and understood, but why the government collapsed so quickly, I think, is when the security forces collapsed, the government was going to collapse. And in both cases, the United States spent a lot of money creating unsustainable structures. I don't think, to one of the questions that were asked, is that all that money was wasted. I mean, I think for 20 years, girls went to school, right? For 20 years, people had access to better healthcare. And it is a profound human tragedy that those gains are lost. But I also, that the government's collapse, this was, I have a hard time thinking of a counterfactual unless the United States and the international community were going to stay there for 30 more years, which was just unsustainable. And it takes me back, I think, again, to this question of the rural and urban divide, right? Our eyes are on Kabul and Mazar-i-Sharif and Kandahar and elsewhere. But the situation in other parts of the country was quite bad for a number of years in terms of the impact of the ongoing violence. So, there's going to be PhDs and books and all sorts of stuff written on why the government collapsed. But I do think it has to do with this idea of trying to create systems and structures that were not fit for purpose, trying to do too much. And, it is an unfortunate reality that I am skeptical that the lessons are going to be learned. And there was a question about the humanitarians' own reflection. I do think that the humanitarian and development community need to do its own reflections on to what extent they were part and parcel of a process that was in some ways doomed to fail, and how that informs the way humanitarian NGOs and development organizations work with donors and partners in other parts of the world in the future.
Jacob, thanks very much. Thanks to all of you, Fulya, Jacob, Magdalena, for this terrific conversation. And, we ended on a note about lessons an ongoing conversation we're sure to have. We're going to continue to have that conversation. I hope you'll come back and help us have that in the future. And I hope also we'll be able to have Zarifa Ghaffari with us at some point. Very sorry she wasn't able to join, but these things are sometimes not so easy to arrange, but we'll have to try to get her back on another occasion. Let me just say a few final words of thanks. First of all, to the Union of Chambers and Commodity Exchanges of Turkey, under whose program with us here in Brussels, run by my colleague, Kadri Taştan, a senior fellow with us here. This conversation has been held in that context, and we're very grateful to them and to Kadri for putting this together, and also to Annika Vollmer, who helped to make all of this happen. And let me also say thanks to all of you who've joined us and stayed with the conversation and answered, well, gave us some questions and made some comments. We look forward to seeing you again soon. Hopefully we'll be able to do this in person at some point. But in the meantime, all the best from Geneva. Thanks so much.